The silent hunt the Kethrin were ghosts among the stars. For 3 centuries they had swept through the outer rim territories like a plague of silence, leaving nothing but empty worlds in their wake. Their chitinous bodies moved without sound, through the void, their ships cloaked in technology that bent light itself. They were the apex predators of the galaxy, and they had never met a species they couldn't eliminate. Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the viewport of the research vessel Endeavor, staring down at what had once been New Providence. The colony of 12,000 souls had simply vanished. No signs of struggle, no bodies, no distress signals, just empty buildings and the eerie quiet of a world suddenly stripped of life. "Third colony this month," muttered Captain Jake Morrison, joining her at the observation deck. His weathered face bore the marks of 20 years on the frontier, but Elena had never seen him look this troubled. Haven's Rest went dark 2 weeks ago. Stellar Point just stopped responding yesterday. Elena turned from the viewport, her dark eyes reflecting the cold light of distant stars. As the Colonial Science Division's leading xenobiologist, she had studied dozens of extinct civilizations. But this was different. This was systematic, methodical, and terrifyingly efficient. "The pattern is too precise," she said, pulling up holographic displays of the affected systems. "Look at the spacing, the timing. These aren't random attacks. Someone is hunting us." The Kethrin had rules. They always hunted alone, stalking their prey for weeks before striking. They preferred isolated targets, settlements far from military protection, and they never left evidence of their presence. To them, humans were just another inferior species to be catalogued and eliminated. Commander Thexkar adjusted his sensory organs as he observed the human settlement below. The creatures moved with such predictable patterns, completely unaware of the death that watched from above. His mandibles clicked with satisfaction. These humans would be as easy as the Vorthak had been, or the peace-loving Zenari before them. The attack on New Providence came at dawn. The colonists were preparing for another day of terraforming work when shadows began moving through the settlement. The Kethrin struck with surgical precision, their bioelectric weapons paralyzing victims before they could even scream. Within hours, the entire population had been harvested for the hive ships orbiting in the dark between stars. But the Kethrin made their first mistake that day. A maintenance worker named David Chen had been outside the settlement when the attack began. Hidden in the terraform equipment bay, he watched the entire assault through his worksuit's recording system. For the first time in 3 centuries, the Kethrin had a witness. The footage reached Captain Morrison within days. Elena watched it dozens of times, analyzing every frame. The attackers moved like liquid shadow, their forms barely visible even on enhanced recordings. But she could see them now, and that changed everything. "Insectoid," she whispered, freeze-framing an image of a Kethrin warrior. 8 limbs, exoskeleton designed for stealth operations. Look at those sensory organs. They're hunting by bioelectric signatures. Morrison leaned forward. "Can we stop them?" Elena's jaw tightened. "We can try." The Emergency Colonial Defense Initiative formed within a week. Unlike the slow bureaucracy of the Central Systems, the frontier colonies moved with desperate efficiency. Elena found herself appointed as chief scientific advisor, working alongside Morrison as they tried to understand an enemy that had never been successfully resisted. The first breakthrough came from studying the attack patterns. The Kethrin weren't just random raiders. They were part of a larger hive network that had been systematically clearing the galaxy for centuries. Each attack was reported back to the collective, allowing them to refine their methods for maximum efficiency. "They think we're like all the others," Elena realized during a late-night strategy session. "Passive, predictable, easy to eliminate. They've never encountered organized resistance." Morrison smiled grimly. "Then it's time to give them a surprise." The trap was set at Meridian Station, a mining outpost that fit the Kethrin's preferred target profile. But this time the humans were ready. Hidden sensors detected the approaching hive ship days before it arrived. The colonists evacuated to prepared bunkers while Elena and Morrison's team waited in concealment. When the Kethrin descended, they found what appeared to be another helpless settlement. The warriors moved through the empty buildings with practiced efficiency, searching for bioelectric signatures. But the humans had learned to hide their presence using shielded suits and careful positioning to avoid detection. The first Kethrin to die had been hunting for over 50 years. It never saw the projectile that pierced its exoskeleton, fired from a concealed position 200 meters away. The creature's death cry, a high-pitched shriek that humans could barely hear, alerted the others that something had changed. "Commander," Thexkar felt the shock ripple through the hunting party. In 3 centuries of conquest, no prey had ever struck back. The humans were supposed to be helpless, easy targets like all the others. But now one of his warriors was dead, and the strange bipeds were nowhere to be found. The battle that followed lasted 3 hours. The Kethrin, used to overwhelming helpless victims, found themselves facing an enemy that fought back with tactical precision. Human soldiers used the colony's industrial equipment as weapons, turning mining charges into improvised explosives and construction mechs into combat suits. Elena watched from the command bunker as her theories proved correct. The Kethrin were incredibly efficient hunters, but they had never learned to adapt to resistance. Their centuries of easy victories had made them overconfident and predictable. When the dust settled, 12 Kethrin warriors lay dead. The surviving humans had captured enough equipment and biological samples to begin understanding their enemy's technology. More importantly, they had broken the myth of Kethrin invincibility. Morrison activated the colony's emergency beacon, broadcasting the battle footage across the frontier networks. Within hours, every human settlement in the Outer Rim knew that the mysterious attackers could be defeated. But Elena knew this was just the beginning. The Kethrin hive ships were already adapting, analyzing the failure at Meridian Station. The next attack would be different, more careful, more deadly. "They'll come again," she told Morrison as they examined the captured Kethrin technology. "And they'll be ready for our tricks this time." Morrison nodded, but his eyes held a new determination. "Then we'll have to be ready with new ones." The message that reached the Kethrin High Command was unprecedented. Never before had a hunting party failed so completely. The humans had not only resisted but actively hunted the hunters. The collective mind struggled to process this impossible data. For the first time in their species' history, the Kethrin felt something approaching uncertainty. These humans were unlike any prey they had encountered. Instead of cowering in fear, they had studied their attackers and learned to fight back. But the Kethrin were nothing if not adaptable. If the humans wanted a war, they would get one. The High Command began mobilizing resources from across their territory, calling in hunting fleets that had been scattered across a dozen star systems. The humans had won their first battle, but they had also painted a target on their entire species. The Kethrin were coming, and this time they would bring the full weight of their centuries-old hunting machine. Elena stood on the observation deck of the now fortified Meridian Station, watching as human ships arrived from across the frontier. Colony defense forces, mining security fleets, even some volunteer vessels from the inner systems. Word of the victory had spread, and humanity was beginning to unite against the threat. "Think we have a chance?" Morrison asked, joining her as another transport docked with the station. Elena looked out at the growing fleet, then down at her research notes on Kethrin biology and tactics. The data was incomplete, but it told a story of a species that had grown complacent through endless easy victories. They had never learned to innovate under pressure because they had never needed to. Humans, on the other hand, had built their entire civilization on adaptation and cooperation. Every challenge had made them stronger, more creative, more determined to survive. "I think," Elena said slowly, "they picked the wrong species to hunt." The Human Response Commander Sarah Chen had spent 15 years fighting pirates and raiders along the frontier. She thought she had seen every kind of enemy the galaxy could throw at humanity. Then the reports started coming in from Meridian Station, and she realized she had been preparing for the wrong war entirely. The Kethrin response to their first defeat was swift and overwhelming. 3 hive ships, each the size of a small city, emerged from hyperspace at the edge of human territory. Their bioorganic hulls pulsed with alien life, and their sensor arrays began methodically mapping every human settlement within 50 light-years. Sarah studied the intelligence reports. In her cramped quarters aboard the frigate Defiance, the enemy ships moved like living creatures, their formations too fluid for conventional military tactics. But Elena Vasquez's research had revealed something crucial. The Kethrin were not just hunters, they were specialists. Each hive ship contained thousands of warriors bred for specific environments and prey types. "They're overconfident," Sarah muttered, highlighting patterns in the enemy movement data. "Look at this formation. They're not even trying to hide their approach." Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, frowned at the display. "Maybe they don't need to. Those ships could glass a dozen colonies before we could intercept them." Sarah shook her head. "That's not how they operate. Elena's research shows they prefer to harvest populations intact. They'll send hunting parties to each settlement just like before. But the Kethrin had learned from Meridian Station. This time their hunting parties were larger, better equipped, and supported by orbital reconnaissance. The first attack came against a mining colony called Frontier's Edge. The colonists had prepared defensive positions and early warning systems, but the Kethrin adapted their tactics in real time. Instead of the usual stealth approach, they came in overwhelming numbers. Waves of warriors descended from multiple directions while bioships provided covering fire from orbit. The human defenders fought bravely, but they were outnumbered 10-1. Sarah watched the battle footage with growing anger. The colonists had followed the Meridian protocols perfectly, but the enemy had simply brought more forces than the defenses could handle. 1,200 humans died in the first hour. "We need a new approach," she told Elena during an emergency conference. "They're adapting faster than we can build defenses." Elena's image flickered on the holographic display, transmitted from her research facility on Kepler Station. "I've been analyzing the captured biosamples from Meridian. The Kethrin have a weakness we can exploit." She brought up detailed scans of Kethrin neural tissue. "They're hive-minded, but not in the way we first thought. Each warrior maintains individual consciousness while connected to a command network. But that connection works both ways." Sarah leaned forward. "Meaning?" "Meaning if we can disrupt their communications, we don't just blind them, we cause psychological trauma. They've never had to operate without the collective guidance." The plan that emerged from this discovery became known as the Ghost Protocol. Instead of building static defenses, human forces would use mobility and misdirection to turn the Kethrin's own strengths against them. Small teams of specialists would target communication nodes, while larger forces created false signatures to confuse enemy sensors. Specialist Alex Torres volunteered for the first Ghost Protocol mission. A former communications engineer turned soldier. He had studied the Kethrin biotech extensively with Elena's research team. His mission was simple in concept but terrifying in execution: infiltrate a hive ship and plant signal jammers in their central communication chamber. The insertion took place during a Kethrin assault on the agricultural world of New Harvest. While the enemy focused on the surface battle, Alex's team used captured Kethrin stealth technology to approach the orbiting hive ship. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were using the hunter's own tools against them. The interior of the hive ship was a nightmare of organic architecture. Walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, and the air thrummed with subsonic frequencies that made human bones ache. Alex forced himself to focus on the mission as his team moved through corridors that seemed more grown than built. They found the communication chamber at the ship's heart, a vast spherical room filled with neural interface pods. Dozens of Kethrin coordinators floated in biofluid, their minds linked directly to the hunting parties below. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Alex placed the first jammer with shaking hands. The device, barely larger than his thumb, contained a quantum processor programmed with Elena's neural disruption algorithms. As it activated, the effect was immediate and devastating. The coordinated assault on New Harvest dissolved into chaos. Hunting parties found themselves cut off from command guidance for the first time in their lives. Warriors who had never needed to think independently began making critical errors. Some froze in confusion, others attacked their own allies, and a few simply collapsed from the psychological shock. Commander Thexakar felt the network connection sever like a physical wound. The comforting presence of the collective mind vanished, leaving him alone with thoughts and sensations he had never needed to process independently. Around him, his warriors stumbled and shrieked as they experienced the same terrifying isolation. The humans had done something impossible. They had turned the Kethrin's greatest strength into a weakness, transforming unified hunters into confused individuals. For the first time in his life, Thexakar experienced something his species had thought eliminated from their psychology centuries ago: fear. The success at New Harvest marked a turning point in the conflict. Human forces began implementing Ghost Protocol tactics across the frontier. Strike teams infiltrated hive ships during battles, communication jammers disrupted enemy coordination, and psychological warfare campaigns targeted the Kethrin's newfound vulnerability to isolation. Sarah led the largest Ghost Protocol operation at the Battle of Crimson Ridge. 3 hive ships had converged on the heavily industrialized system, intending to harvest its population of over 2 million humans. Instead, they found a trap that had been weeks in the making. The battle began conventionally enough. Kethrin hunting parties descended on major population centers while their bioships engaged the human fleet in orbit. But as the assault reached its peak, Ghost Protocol teams struck simultaneously at all 3 hive ships. The effect was catastrophic for the attackers. Entire hunting formations began operating at cross purposes as their command networks collapsed. Warriors found themselves making tactical decisions without the collective wisdom they had relied on for millennia. Sarah watched from the bridge of the Defiance as enemy formations disintegrated. Elena was right, she told Marcus. They're not just hunters. They're cogs in a machine that's forgotten how to function when the gears stop turning. But the Kethrin were not finished. The High Command, observing these defeats from their distant homeworld, began implementing countermeasures. They developed new communication protocols, trained warriors for independent operation, and started using different psychological conditioning techniques. The war evolved into a deadly game of adaptation and counter-adaptation. Each side learned from defeats and modified their tactics accordingly. But humans had one crucial advantage. They had been adapting and innovating for their entire evolutionary history. Elena's research teams worked around the clock to stay ahead of Kethrin modifications. They developed new jamming techniques, created psychological profiles of enemy subspecies, and even began limited experiments with captured biotechnology. The hunter-prey relationship had reversed, with humans now studying their former predators with scientific precision. The final confrontation came at the Nexus Point, a strategic system that controlled hyperspace routes throughout the sector. The Kethrin committed their entire regional fleet, 12 hive ships and thousands of support vessels. It was meant to be their decisive victory, the blow that would break human resistance once and for all. Instead, it became their greatest defeat. Sarah coordinated the largest Ghost Protocol operation in human history, with over 200 infiltration teams striking simultaneously. The Kethrin fleet, suddenly robbed of coordination, began firing on its own ships in the confusion. Alex Torres led the strike against the command hive ship, fighting through biocorridors now filled with panicked warriors. The Kethrin had become so dependent on their collective consciousness that isolation drove many of them into catatonic states. In the command chamber, Alex found Commander Thexakar huddled in a corner, his sensory organs flickering erratically. The proud hunter who had orchestrated the elimination of dozens of species was now a trembling wreck. Overwhelmed by sensations his mind couldn't process alone. "You should have studied us better," Alex said quietly, placing the final jammer. "Humans don't just survive. We learn." The Battle of Nexus Point broke the Kethrin war machine. Surviving hive ships retreated to the deep galaxy, their crews traumatized by the experience of psychological isolation. The species that had terrorized the rim worlds for centuries had encountered something they couldn't adapt to fast enough: human ingenuity, backed by desperate determination. In the aftermath, Elena stood once again on an observation deck. This time watching as human ships escorted captured Kethrin vessels to research facilities. The hunters had become specimens, their technology and biology studied by the same species they had dismissed as inferior prey. "The galaxy's going to be a different place now," Sarah said, joining her at the viewport. "Word is spreading. Other species are learning that the Kethrin can be defeated." Elena nodded, thinking about the implications. Humanity had not just survived a predator species, they had turned the tables completely. The psychological impact would ripple across the galaxy for generations. "They made a fundamental error," she said finally. "They assumed that because something worked for centuries, it would always work. But evolution doesn't stop just because you're successful. And sometimes the prey evolves faster than the predator." The Kethrin High Command received the final reports from Nexus Point with something approaching disbelief. An entire fleet, hundreds of thousands of warriors, defeated by a species they had catalogued as primitive mammals. The implications were staggering. For the first time in their species' memory, the Kethrin faced a choice they had never needed to make: adapt or become extinct themselves. The humans had shown them that the galaxy was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined, filled with species that could learn, grow, and fight back with devastating effectiveness. The age of easy conquest was over. The hunters had learned to fear the hunted, and the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted permanently. Humanity had not just survived their first encounter with apex predators, they had claimed that title for themselves. Elena's final report to the Colonial Defense Initiative was both a victory declaration and a warning. The Kethrin threat was contained, but the universe was vast and full of dangers humanity had yet to encounter. The species that had once cowered in isolated settlements now looked to the stars with new confidence. They had been hunted across the galaxy by creatures that considered them easy prey. Instead, they had proven something that would echo through the cosmic community for generations to come. Never underestimate a species that has learned to turn adversity into strength. The hunters had become the hunted, and the galaxy would never be the same.